Iran isn't just a foreign policy issue anymore. It's a stress test for the entire MAGA media machine. For years, the pitch was simple: trust Donald Trump, distrust the establishment, and stop letting Washington drag America into wars it didn't have to fight. But now the argument is happening inside the House. Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene have broken from the GOP. Megyn Kelly is pressing all the issues from the inside. Ben Shapiro and Mark Levin are holding the staunch pro Israel line. Throw in the Epstein files, a lack of transparency, betrayal politics, and a media universe built on divisiveness, and you get the real question. When your movement becomes the institution, do you still demand limits on power? This is Liberty Lens, and here to help me suss out all these very interesting questions is none other than my friend and co-host, Mr. Mike Tremont. Mike, how are you today?
Good. It's good to be with you, John. As always, very interesting to see how you framed it up. Everything you said is obviously pertinent to the debate that we have inside the Republican Party right now. I am going to take a shot at making the case that the war is being used as a tool for division
Mm,
rather than this party would be in complete unity were it not for the war, right? And
right.
and and the division over the war is imposing itself on the party. I
Yeah.
think that division sells. I think division is entertainment. I think that division is the the coin of the realm. It's not merely the process that we follow now in order to get to solutions. It is the solution, right? It is the objective for many, many people, both in terms of politicians in our party, inside the Republican Party, as well as media and in particular podcasters surrounding it. Good for you for putting your finger on that. And for this reason, I feel as though if it weren't for the war, maybe we'd be having a very similarly contentious debate about something else. Maybe it would be about the budget, maybe it would be about trans as it was a
Yeah.
little while ago, maybe it would be over the role of Christian nationalism and Muslims, uh, pro-life.
Right.
There are any number of important issues to a whole bunch of Republicans. I'm not suggesting that any of those are more important or even as important at the moment as war is,
Right.
but I do believe that we would find something to punch each other in the face over if the war were not raging.
Right. And as always, there's going to be flashpoints politically that constantly have a feedback loop, right? So, listen, much as we said Obama was the first president to really understand and take advantage of social media, when it came to fundraising, when it came to leveraging social media back in the day. And if it wasn't Obama, it was certainly the team he put around him who understood the benefit of data in that sense in a rapidly evolving world.
Yeah.
I think it could be fairly said. I mean, maybe you disagree, but I don't think many people would disagree with the fact to say that President Trump and his team really were the first to take advantage of the podcast universe politically and also leverage that into their media distribution outlets. Obviously, it started with Roger Ailes and Fox News, Rupert Murdoch to some extent, and that continues. Obviously, went on with Steve Bannon and the rest of them. Uh,
Sure.
so
No, I don't disagree.
oh,
Let me jump in there before
sure.
you get to the next part because I think that both your parts are going to be really important.
Mm,
Um, I do agree, but I also believe that Trump is content being used by the division machine.
yes,
When he came along, well, it depends on how you characterize came along, right?
right,
Trump was obviously a source for the New York Post for many, many years, as you and I know, right? From having spent time around New York, especially in the 80s and the 90s. He's been a source of fun material for media before podcasts, before we were online.
right,
Uh, when it was just what used to be mainstream media, let your viewers decide whether we characterize the New York Post as mainstream media. I think in those days we would have characterized as being
Tabloid.
fairly over to one side.
Yeah.
And these days, looking back, I think you'd have to, most people would characterize it as mainstream media, right? A newspaper, gee whiz, a
Right.
newspaper, it's got more gray hair than I do.
Mhm.
So it, that's kind of funny. But I think that when Trump came along, there were people at Fox News who decided to lean into Trump, to take advantage of Trump, to back Trump, to, more important than back him, to platform him,
Mm.
right? He was content inventory for
Oh, sure.
Fox News and for a lot of other podcasters. When he came along, podcasters were starting to roll and mainstream media was declining in its proportionate influence. And so I think one can fairly say, just as you did, that he was the first one to understand this and to use it. But I think it also needs to be said that he was the best thing that ever happened to a lot of these
Oh,
independent podcasters.
yeah, and let's face it, he was also huge for what was left of the legacy mainstream media. I mean,
That's right.
I think a lot of us I don't think it's crazy to say now, CNN treated him as a joke candidate in 2016, giving him free airtime, thinking that, like, "This guy is so ridiculous, he'll give us ratings while sinking the Republican Party." I don't think that's
He remains content inventory for CNN. I watch some CNN, uh, and I can tell you that if 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 President Trump were not in the White House, they would have very little to talk about. If you if you were to listen to what they do today, they spend an enormous amount of time complaining about him in terms of policy, him in
right,
terms of success, him in terms of the economy, and now they like to blame him for the economy. They blame him for the war. They blame him for anything they can blame on. They complain about his personality, what he focuses on, and in one of the funniest things, I think, they go after him for his health, right? Because they got to make up for lost time, right?
right,
We didn't pay enough attention to Joe Biden, so we need to now pretend that we're concerned with President Trump in terms of being all there. His mental acuity. I appreciated what someone on CNN recently said, which was, as Democrats, I'm not sure we wouldn't be better off if he were diminished in his capacity.
right,
The
right,
implication is, say what you will about the old man's IQ, he's kicking Democrats' ass right now. So
right.
there's that.
Mhm. You're right, and what's interesting is how the media landscape has fractured and where we think but the question also is so I think this is layered, and I think there's some nuance to it, right? So first, let's talk about some of these media battles that are taking place
Yeah,
with significant figures. Then we're going to transition into the overall um, metaphysical question of divisiveness in media, because I think that in itself needs a little bit of
yeah,
your focus, and then we can wrap it up with the effect this is having, the tangible effect that we see, whether it's polls or
yep,
actual
yep,
policy decisions. So I
yep.
think we can wrap it up. By the way, everyone out there, if this is at all interesting to you, or even if it's not, please hit the subscribe button, give us a like. It helps us with the algorithm. Please go ahead and do that for Liberty Lens. We really appreciate it. Okay, let's start out by Mike. I'm going to toss out a few names. These are big names in the MAGA sphere. We'll use that for the media universe, both podcast and mainstream. So one of the first ones who had huge ramifications just today, Tucker Carlson.
Yep.
Tucker Carlson, in addition to his media moves in terms of business, leaving Fox News or being fired, depending on your point of view, starting his own media network on X at Elon's request, right? We all know that.
Yep.
Just announced he's leaving the Republican Party. And despite being a critic at times,
As he would say, no longer supports the
no longer
Republican Party.
supports. He's leaving the Republican Party um, because claiming it is no longer America First, that they have basically sold out all their supporters. Now, this is not a flippant supporter, right? Staunch Republican, 35, 40 years. I remember him with his little bow tie as a young man coming on CNN and what was that thing that he had with the liberal, not firing line, the other one? where they took opposite ends on CNN. I forget the
Yeah, 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 yeah.
very popular in the late '80s, early
Sure,
'90s.
sure, sure, sure,
Made
sure.
his bones there. Anyway, both he and Marjorie Taylor Greene immediately came out and said the same thing. She is no longer considering herself a Republican.
Yep.
Tucker Carlson, very anti-interventionalist, very anti-Israel, not anti-Jewish. Let's be very clear, but anti-Israel. Hates the war in Iran.
At the very
Constantly
least, I think it might be more fair to say anti-Israeli government.
anti-Israeli government. Absolutely.
I mean, and to be fair, full disclosure, I've been pretty pissed off with the Israeli
Right.
government myself recently too, and I speak as someone who loves Israel and who's traveled all over Israel. I'm pretty pissed off at their foreign policy positions lately too. Just full disclosure.
Right. Carlson also has a huge platform, and he's taken to task a lot of the inner circle of President Trump. Very
Yep.
famously, Ted Cruz, to the point where President Trump has made comments anti Tucker Carlson comments.
Yep.
That he doesn't know what's
Yep.
going on and so forth. So,
Which I'm
well,
sure Tucker loves, right?
right, Tucker loves that. Now, specific to Tucker Carlson, and I'm gonna give you a chance to talk about this. I'm just setting it up for you. Tucker Carlson has had two major beefs in recent weeks. One is with Ben Shapiro, and that seems to be ongoing because of Ben Shapiro's pro-Israeli support, staunch
Yep.
pro-Israel support, I should say,
Yep.
and also the fact that Tucker platformed Nick Fuentes,
Yep.
a Christian white nationalist
Yep.
operating on the fringes of what people call either the new right, the dissident right, the alt right. So he's sort of like that fringe that, and a lot of people are saying, why would Tucker Carlson platform him
Yep.
unless he had
Look,
something else? So
yeah.
talk to me. Let's start with
Tucker,
Tucker Carlson.
yeah, Tucker makes very little effort to maintain his credibility. He's not about credibility, right?
Define,
For as hard as,
I was going to say, define what you mean by credibility,
yeah,
because
the
I think that's
idea
no
that
longer
people should view him as a source of information.
okay. Because I was going to say credibility now is different than when you and I would say we disagree with the New York Times, but they're credible, right?
Well, good point.
Back in the
At the very least, we used to be able to say the New York Times wouldn't say anything off of their editorial pages. They wouldn't say anything that weren't true. And they have done so much with their editorial pages that it makes you wonder whether you can trust their reporting as well. That's a different discussion. But Tucker, he is in the not merely the killed JFK camp, but did we land on the moon? Are there aliens living among us? That's his jam. And I don't mean that he's a conspiracy theorist per se, like he only talks about conspiracy theories because that's the majority. No, that's not what I mean. What I mean is he is certainly open to that type of thinking because he is about providing entertainment that is related to public policy.
mm,
He is not in the business of analyzing public policy. The Supreme Court of the United States is going to release a few important decisions today. You would not go to Tucker's show. One would be ill advised to go to Tucker's show to get an analysis of why the Supreme Court decided certain decisions the way that it did, right? And
right.
I don't mean that just because he's not an attorney. I mean that because he's not going to say anything that he doesn't view as potentially entertaining for his audience. This is the fundamental problem. And I should point out, in defense of Tucker, I should point out that I believe he would say he hasn't in the past actually been a Republican. He's been very conservative. He's obviously been very supportive of President Trump in the past. He's very supportive of the Republican Party. But I think he is going to make the argument that I've always had air between me and the Republican Party because I'm not the kind of guy that just gets involved with the party and does whatever a party tells me to do. I think that's going to be his shtick, right?
Well,
Whether you find that credible or not, I
yeah,
don't know.
I'm just quoting him. I actually, right before we sat down,
Yeah.
he actually said, "I am done with the Republican Party. I have been a supporter," those were his words,
Right.
"for 35 years," or whatever. Ex
Exactly. But he would not characterize himself as a part of it, of inside it. The way, for example, I would,
mm.
right? I campaigned for George Herbert Walker Bush and Dan Quayle. I campaigned for Bob Dole. Kids, ask your parents. I I campaigned for W, right? And gave money to certain candidates. Things like this. I campaigned today for the Republican Liberty Caucus,
Right.
right? I don't think I would be able to get away with saying I'm not really a part of the Republican Party. That would be very difficult. Whereas Carlson is going to try to make this argument that he's a part of the media. He's never really been a part of the party. He's been a supporter of the party. I think he's going to try to, that might sound like threading the needle to a lot of people, but just trying to be fair to Tucker's, you know, attempt at finding the eye of the needle.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting about Tucker Carlson is I can't actually tell you that he fits under one label politically.
Right.
Like, I can't call him a Republican, I can't call him a traditional conservative, although that might be the one that, like,
Well, I think
ideologically.
it's one that he would like. I would call him a populist, even though he's a populist who doesn't see eye to eye with populist President Trump.
Right. He's very hard to nail down, and in some ways, you have to admire that because he doesn't conform necessarily. I wouldn't call him a libertarian. Um,
Well, yes, I agree with you to the extent to which he doesn't conform to institutions.
yes.
But remember, populists are definitionally aphilosophical.
Right.
So y- there are many flavors. So you could you and President Trump could be quite angry with each other over any number of issues, and each call each other populists. Each
Right. In that
themselves
in
populists.
that sense, I agree with you. But if you were to say, it's just that I find he's very eclectic in what he believes and what he holds. So, on the one hand, someone who believes in capitalism, but at the same time wants, for example, minimum wages and guaranteed jobs and price
Yeah,
controls.
he's a
Right.
popular. There is no philosophy that holds that bag together. It's
Right.
just whatever is popular with him in his brain at the moment, and if it catches traction with his audience, he'll run with it.
Exactly. Okay. So we have Tucker, who's sort of a not sort of, he is a populist. And that now is hitting head up within the MAGA world. Now, remember, I would venture to say that that in 2020, for example, after President Trump lost, all the people we're talking about were all, I would say, universally loved within the MAGA sphere. Everyone listened to everyone. They were all supportive of each other. And the reason I put this up is because that's no longer the case.
I think they were all riding the same Trump train.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. So, like, but if you look at their public face, I would say they all played well together on the same playground. They all used the same sandbox. They were all happy, right? But starting off with Tucker, now if we look at his two direct beefs right now, you look at Ben Shapiro and say someone like Candace Owens. And when you're looking at, say, with Ben Shapiro, I think it's very obvious where the fault line is there, and it's all 100% Israel. Ben Shapiro um, is obviously a religious Jew, as he says, and it's no secret, right? He's very pro Israel. He couches it in conservatism, he couches it in what's best for America. And in that sense, guys like him, Mark Levin, in some ways, they're very much the traditional conservatives, say, of the Reagan era, of the Bush era, Bush 1 era, that you didn't question the relationship with Israel. Uh, Israeli and U.S. foreign policy were hand in hand. Folks, check out the previous episode if you want Mike's take on that. Uh, but now Ben Shapiro, who is very popular, was very popular, still is popular, but declining in
Still
MAGA
is,
circles,
yeah.
has come now head to head with Tucker Carlson. And
And I might suggest that while that's true, each each has sought this out to a certain extent.
agreed.
Each believes that they will benefit by pissing off the other one and making the other one talk about him.
Sure, they're mining each other's audience because what is it? Controversy creates cash, right? So we get that part of it. But Mike, you mentioned credibility of Tucker Carlson.
Yeah.
Do you feel Ben Shapiro is any more or less credible? And as a counterweight, I'll give you Ben Shapiro is a lawyer. Ben Shapiro does have
Yes, it depends on your topic. As a matter of fact, this is how I'd characterize Ben Shapiro. When it comes to everything other than the Israeli government, everything other than the Israeli government, I have found him to be enormously credible.
Mhm,
He works very, very hard on his research. I'm sure he's got a team that helps him with that.
right.
But he's obviously an exceedingly smart guy, right? He is a student of history, reads and writes all the time. He works very hard at protecting his credibility, but also developing the background awareness of his stories. He has a libertarian streak. He often parts ways with the other stable of podcasters at the Daily Wire over his libertarian streak. And for that reason, I have appreciated Ben Shapiro a great deal over the years. Indeed, talk about SCOTUS. If you're a conservative, frankly, even if maybe, especially if you're not, but if you're a conservative, I would recommend Shapiro as being your go-to guy for analyzing SCOTUS decisions. He's excellent. He's excellent. Very, very smart. And that's one of the reasons why it's so frustrating that he has this big blind spot when it comes to the Israeli government. He is willing to give them a pass on almost anything. And I don't, you know, you want to say, well, he's young,
Mhm.
right? He doesn't understand how we got in this situation. But unless you can't remember anything before October 6th, if you're not a student of history, maybe I can give you a pass. But Ben Shapiro, I can't give him a pass. He is biased. I haven't heard him admit to being biased, but I suspect that he would, right? And look, we all have biases, right? Maybe this is a weird thing. I'm just making this up as I go here, but maybe I'd be pissed off and on the side of the Lutheran church if they got into a hot war or something. I don't know, I'm just making that up, right? But people do get upset, right? And I still root for the Cubs, even though they suck. Uh, you know, these things happen. It's part of human nature, and we're a tribal species. But just because you can understand it doesn't mean we ought to be excusing it, and doesn't mean that we ought to be deferring in our analysis to Ben Shapiro when it comes to the Israeli government. So having said that, he and Tucker are at odds with each other, and Shapiro's going after others and they're going after him. I think one of the most interesting fights out there is with Candace Owens.
Yeah, she was next on my list for you to
Ah,
talk about.
let me put out a couple of things and get your reaction. Um, Candace is. There are people now who are saying that Candace became famous because of Ben Shapiro. That's not really accurate. She joined Shapiro's team when she was already doing pretty well. Okay, she wasn't a nobody, right? Very talented, had a big following. I don't have numbers, but she had a big following. I mean, all of us knew who she was, even if we weren't fans or weren't listening. We all knew who she was. Very, very smart, very articulate, and very thoughtful, fairly circumspect. A lot of us thought she was a decent fit for the Daily Wire, even if you disagree with a lot of what those guys say. That's their style. Their style is to be thoughtful and analytic, and at the same time biased toward their cause. They got the Ben who's pro-Israel, and then they've got other guys who are Christian nationalists, other guys who are all about family issues. They've all got their bugaboos, their hobby horses, but they all position themselves as thoughtful. And for this reason, Candace Owens, being a conservative and thoughtful, we all figured that she would fit in. Well, they had their falling out over a couple of different issues, but including the Israeli government, and she went her own way. And after that, it was largely after that she began leaning into some of these, I don't even know what to call them, weird conspiracy theories. The funniest, most interesting, and most beneficial to her, well, I don't actually know that it's the most beneficial to her, but one of the most interesting ones and freakiest is that she says she believes that Bridget Macron is a guy, that Bridget Macron, the president of France's wife,
Yeah.
is actually her brother, not herself,
Mm.
and is a guy. And I it's not true, by the way. It's not that I can prove it, but I don't think it's true. But this is what I want your reaction to. I don't think Candace Owens believes it.
I agree with you. I don't think she believes it either. And I would push back on Candace Owens a little bit because, first of all, I think we could put her in the populist camp, but the fringe
Yeah,
populist camp, right? Um, a little bit of background. Yes, the her time at the Daily Wire may have helped her in terms of exposure and all that.
yep.
One of the things that struck me, I would push back a little bit on the fact that she's thoughtful. That
Ah,
that that because I remember seeing her very early on another guy who was involved in the MAGA sphere, Joe Rogan's podcast, where
yeah,
her star was just starting to rise just in
yeah,
terms of popularity.
yeah,
And she came on, and Joe Rogan at that point wasn't full MAGA yet. He was one of these, like, I'm just asking questions guys.
yeah,
And he talked to her about, and she had her talking points where this is, the trans movement is, going to destroy America. She had her
yeah, 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 yeah.
conservative talking points, and at one point, she started to talk about climate change. And Rogan, who is no genius himself, just asked two or three questions, very simple, like, well, what about X, Y, and Z? And all she could do was repeat the talking points. And then when he said, okay, let's research this together. And you saw this play out in real time, which is why I question her thoughtfulness. I'm not
Yeah.
going to say intelligence, but to some extent. And you could see she had no response to stuff that was being brought up in real time on the internet, like, oh, how about this scientist? Or what about this fact? What about this,
Yeah.
this, and this?
Right, right,
Are
right.
you at least willing to say we don't know enough? She wouldn't even concede that. So from that, I said to myself, she's jumping on the Steven Crowder, that type of grift where it's like, okay, we see the Trump train coming. I have to jump on this dude's coattails, right? And the way to do that is to start screaming about climate change is a plot. The aliens are real. There would never it was a moon landing. The earth is flat because at one time or another, she's embraced all of that. Now, what I
Yeah,
will give her credit for, Mike, which I think it might be part of what you're alluding to, is she's learned how to use facts, and I'm using air quotes, facts to back up her position. And she's learned from Ben Shapiro that rapid fire debate delivery, right? Before I get a word in, she's got 100 in. And they sound like they're well researched, but then you realize they're all nuts. They're like, she's a Holocaust denier, for example, which I'm sure
well,
doesn't
and
hear her
to
Ben
your
Shapiro.
point, I think the way I would characterize it is that being nuts, as you put it,
Mm.
but
My words, not Mike's. My
yeah,
words.
but she
Okay,
is.
fair enough.
You got there before I did.
Okay,
I'm not giving you pushback on your characterization of her being nuts.
okay,
The nutty stuff, and that's more actually, she says nutty things more than she's nutty, because I don't think she believes it. But she says nutty things, and she does a lot of research. I don't think those are inconsistent. I have listened to, this is quite an admission. I probably shouldn't make this admission, but let's go for it.
sure,
I have listened to an entire episode of that podcast she has about Bridget Macron having a penis.
right.
It's fascinating. She is I don't mean it's fascinating. Macron is fascinating. What I mean is her use of her research. I mean, she knows all about these people and details and facts and figures. She really builds her case. At the end of the day, it's not very good, but she really stretches these things out and builds her case with lots of facts and figures and a lot of suppositions that she can't back up, of course.
Right.
And so you have this enormous amount of research that's not really backed up by a lot of hard facts, but enormous amount of research. And then it it's the framework that carries your nuttiness. And that's the type of thoughtful that I mean, right? Because she's very comfortable going into a significant amount of detail. It sounds like she just, screwed up. Maybe she learned her lesson when Rogan took her to task. But when it's something that she thinks is going to make her some coin, she can bring her homework.
I agree, and I think that's a great point that you make because I do think she learned from her embarrassment on that Rogan episode. I
Yeah,
really
yeah,
do think
that's exactly what it sounds
she
like.
learned, or whether her management learned or whatever. They
I'm
said,
never going to be in that position again.
"Right, I can't just repeat talking points. I have to at
Well,
least."
not on the Joe Rogan show. By the way, if you were thinly prepared, that's the last place I would want to be, right?
Well,
I
especially if you
mean, Joe doesn't even end his show until he's decided he's done. You get the impression that if he were mad at you and had you on the ropes, you might be there for a week.
for hours. Yeah, no exaggeration there on your part. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But I think, yeah, they told her, like, especially on Rogan, but just in general, you at least have to weave a better narrative. And I think she absolutely took that to heart. And in that sense, in terms of being someone who can learn from her mistakes, I give her 1,000% credit because I think that's the case.
Yep.
I think that the story about Macron's wife, which she's being sued for by the Macrons, by the way. I don't know exactly where that litigation is, but at one point I think it was for hundreds of millions of dollars. Um, Also the Holocaust denial. She's a very much a Holocaust denier. So, but you would hope that someone like that would not have too much influence in the magosphere. You would hope that someone like that, and another person that we're fond of talking about when it comes to that fringe, whether it's Nick Fuentes or Laura Loomer. There's another one. Laura Loomer might be the only podcaster on the planet that Trump has disavowed from day one publicly, and especially in the second administration, where he said, I can't be seen with her, or whether it was his advisors. Like, she is the one person that I'm aware of that they have completely said, yeah, we can't be
That's
seen
got to
together.
be tough to earn. I was fascinated that today I read for the first time. I don't know if this came out yesterday or the day before, that Candace Owens and Laura Loomer are having this fight about Erica Kirk, right? And
Yes,
about Charlie Kirk.
yes,
Apparently, Loomer had an exchange, had exchanges, had a relationship, had not a friendship, but knew in some professional context, knew Charlie Kirk, and they had texted back and forth a couple of times or something. But Kirk said apparently texted to Owen something along the lines of, that Laura Loomer, she's, sometimes I'm afraid of her, you know. And I have to admit, I mentioned your reaction to this too. Charlie Kirk's posthumous stock rose in my eyes when I read that. You know,
yeah, yeah,
I don't always, I never always agreed with Kirk on a number of things. And I should, everyone says that, but I also should say I did agree with Kirk on a lot of things. A lot of culturally speaking, I think that he and I were in alignment. As a libertarian, I kind of sometimes got uncomfortable with discussing the same material in a political context.
right,
Right. It's good for you for talking about your faith and your family values and, encouraging the youngsters to pursue a relatively conservative lifestyle in their own interest. Uh, I'm on board with almost everything that Charlie Kirk said in that context. Just uncomfortable in a political context saying the same thing, policy context saying the same things, right? That's where libertarians draw the line, no matter how conservative you are. But but when he said he was actually a little afraid of Laura Loomer, I thought, what a almost a sweet, naive thing to say. You know what I mean? Like all of a sudden I saw him as a very young, it had been years ago. Of course, when he was killed, he was still a very, very young man. But he was even younger when this exchange took place. And all of a sudden it made me remember that he was very young at the time and probably a little bit innocent, say what you will about Charlie Kirk, you do get this is my impression. Again, I'm interested in your reaction to this.
Yeah.
I got the impression he was much more sincere. Set the word credibility aside for a minute because he dealt in a lot of faith issues. He wasn't trying to convince you that two and two is four. Um, I always got the impression there was more sincerity there than with a lot of these other goofballs.
Yeah.
And so when he said, "Sometimes I'm a little afraid of that Laura Loomer," you know, I thought that's the kind of thing I think I would say, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
They appreciated that.
Yeah, Charlie Kirk is an issue I wanted to talk about because again, that's another thing that's causing fracture
Yeah.
within the MAGAsphere. Not just Charlie Kirk's
And
murder.
Candace Owens suggesting that Eric Kirk was in on his assassination.
Well, there's a lot of people, and there's a lot of again, this is where the Candace Owens, the populism, the conspiracy theories all intertwine. So let me answer your question
I
about
find
Charlie.
that a lot nastier than Bridget has a penis.
Well, again, it depends what perspective, what lens you use, to pardon the pun. Because, well, to answer your question about Charlie Kirk, I always got the impression with him that he was a sincere kid who came out of those college conservatives.
Yep.
He had a nose for building an organization. He had a
Yep.
talent for that. But
Yep.
I'm not sure that intellectually I would give him too much weight, both politically and in terms of religion, because I've seen a lot of his debates that he had at Cambridge and Oxford where he took on these kids. Ben Shapiro would go over there and have much greater success than, say, Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk would go in there and try to argue on Christian ethics, Christian beliefs, and quite honestly get his ass handed to him by a lot of these Oxford kids and
Sure,
Cambridge
sure,
kids.
sure, sure. I get it.
Yeah.
And that's his thing. That's his framework.
Right. You would have expected him to excel in that environment, and he didn't. So, again, I'm not sure if he was just having a bad couple of nights or whatever, but I
No,
didn't.
I wouldn't even disagree with you, but I'm not arguing that he was a towering intellect. I'm arguing that he seemed to have a lot more sincerity than Candace Owens,
Right, and the reason I kinda
who
brought
doesn't have
that
a
up.
sincere bone in her body.
I agree, and I think the reason I brought it up is because I always felt Charlie Kirk was somebody who grew too fast for the pool he was swimming in. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Sure, sure,
I
sure.
I think he could have seasoned himself into something much more powerful, and perhaps had he not been murdered,
Maybe you would
he
have.
would have, and I think he would have gained that seasoning because how old he was in his early 30s, right? So,
Yeah,
I think, you know now how people have reacted to that is fascinating to me. Whereas Candace Owens said, I like Charlie Kirk, but that Erica. I know, Mike, you don't sort of traffic in these dark areas, but Erica Kirk, there are theories out there that she is a Mossad agent or a Mossad plant
yeah,
who had become Kirk's handler. By marrying him, she was there to keep him in
yeah,
line,
yeah.
make sure he stayed in the pro-Israel lane and
Yeah,
all.
yeah, yeah. No, yeah, I've heard all that.
Right?
I just don't buy it.
No, I don't buy it either, but what I'm saying is that that's what Owens traffics in,
Oh,
and
yeah.
the fact that, like, I've heard her on, like, one of the most fascinating interviews for all this stuff is watch her with Tim Dillon, who's one of the top, uh very intelligent guy, but also very funny, and I think a lot of times when he does these interviews, people just focus on the funny part, and they don't hear what's underneath it, like with the Macron issue, where what convinced me is that Owens doesn't believe anything about what she's saying about Macron is she goes, "Listen, whether it is or isn't, I'm saying it's true, and in the United States, you have to prove, knowing maliciousness and
Yeah.
intent to be sued for slander and libel, and I'm saying up front that I went in with an open mind." So you could see she was playing the legal game, not the I'm a true believer game. And I think that's clearly what she's in for. She's just there to cause controversy. So if she comes out and says, "Hey, Charlie Kirk was honeypotted by Erica Kirk. She's been handling him for years. Look at her history. Where did she come from? She was, doing this and doing that
Oh,
overseas,
yeah, I
and
get it.
and she's having an affair with
Yeah, I mean,
Julia."
I think your overall point is that Candace didn't construct this, she just identified it as a vehicle and she's riding it.
Right, and I think that's where she lives. The
By the
more
way,
Yeah.
I don't think you wanted to bring this up today, but now I can't resist. I do not believe, and
Mm,
I have said words that have led me to believe the veracity of what I'm about to say. I do not believe that President Trump believes that he won the election in 2020. I think he knows damn well that he lost.
right. I think all of us know that, right? And I
Yeah.
think he knows that. And the question is whether these people who are working for Trump know that. And I think none of them do. I think none of them believe
I
that
think it's a loyalty test.
it's a loyalty test. And I
I
think,
think it's the same thing if he said 3 and 3 were 7.
yeah, yeah, it's that old thing from 1984. Like, how many lights do you see? How many fingers am I holding up? It doesn't
Right.
matter. There's an answer you're expected to give, no matter what the truth is. And I think that's what's happening.
Well, and the wackier the better,
Yeah, and that's what's happening in that corner of the magosphere. I
right?
think,
It's not really a loyalty test if you force everyone to say, I like hamburgers,
right,
even if the hamburgers suck. It's a loyalty test when you get your people to say 2 and 2 is 5.
exactly, exactly. And when you look at someone like Laura Loomer, who I think is just nuts, she's very pro-Israeli, obviously, but she's nuts, right? So um, she's fringe. I put her more in the Nick Fuentes category, right? She's going to
Yeah,
have.
now Nick Fuentes is a jerk.
I would agree with that assessment. But here's
That's
here's
a problem. Nick Fuentes doesn't know what he doesn't know.
well, I think he also Nick Fuentes is the classic in high school. I always used to say this. They were the wannabe Nazis, the wannabe fascists. And 90% of what they said was to get a rise out of someone. Pay attention to me. I'm not an athlete. I'm not a scholar. I'm not good looking, but I can say outrageous crap and people will pay attention to me because of it. So he gets on there. He says the most outrageous stuff. And there's that incident where he was live streaming and he thought his camera was off. He thought the stream was ended. It wasn't. And it turns out that he just brought up a whole bunch of gay porn and played it for a while. When his followers confronted him on it, he said, no, 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 that was a Mossad operation to discredit me.
Yeah, because that
And
happens all the time.
right. And there was a large percentage of people who
We're
believed
all aware of all the circumstances in which Mossad has opened up pornography on someone's computer. That
on,
that that
on
happens a lot.
yeah, on somebody's live stream. It happens all the time for people like Nick Fuentes. So now we've gone so far over into the conspiratorial populism with the Loomers, the
Yeah.
Owens, the Nick Fuentes, that now I have to ask you, Mike, back to the original point. Is a more credible populist like Tucker Carlson, like Marjorie Taylor Greene that we mentioned earlier, because I put her in the same category, even though she's not quite the media influencer now, she will be very soon. Um, by taking the Fuentes, by taking the Candace Owens, by taking the Laura Loomer and looping them back in, even if it's over the top, back to someone like a Tucker Carlson. Again, I think something very most people didn't realize the weight of it is Tucker Carlson lending his rub, his legitimacy to Nick Fuentes by interviewing him. Do you think that helps Tucker, hurts him? Like, I think he's been quoted as saying, if I had a chance to do it over again, I wouldn't have, because it really didn't add to anything. It wasn't worth the headache.
Well, that may be, but that's a business decision.
Not
We all make
right.
investments that don't work out as well as we hoped, and we make other investments that work out better than we had foreseen or estimated. I think that's all that means. I don't think he's saying I have learned things about Nick Fuentes and now I don't want to be associated with him. He knew plenty about Nick Fuentes before platforming him, and he was hoping to get a bigger bump than he did. That's all he's saying.
But
He's
but I was gonna I agree with you. I mean, my question was couched as, do you think he knew what Fuentes was all about? But
Yeah,
additionally, I think there is a line to be drawn, because even the Trump administration, when Fuentes kind of scammed his way into Mar-a-Lago and they found out that Fuentes was there, the next day they were very, very careful to note Fuentes does not represent anything
yeah,
President
that's
Trump
just
would.
bad staff work. Of all the things you and I have said multiple times, I think the most frequent is that Trump gets bad staff work.
Right.
The staff knew that Fuentes had a lot of followers, that he was a supporter of the president, and so they invited him in without knowing some of the most goofy things that he says. And to be fair, Nick Fuentes says a lot of things that aren't goofy, right? It's, you know, it, and so if you just sat down and listened to him and watched him, I don't know, you might go hours without seeing something really offensive. I don't know. But the problem is that he has some really fundamentally weird, some fundamental beliefs that are really weird, and some of his beliefs are fundamentally weird. And if you don't know those, you end up inviting this guy to Mar-a-Lago or the White House or somewhere else. And then you get embarrassed after the fact when you realize that it was brought to the administration's attention. It wasn't like all of a sudden they finally did their homework or did their research. They were embarrassed. They should have been embarrassed.
Right.
No, Nick Fuentes is a weirdo, but he's extremely skilled. He's very good at this. I think he's good in a commercial sense, business sense of understanding what sells. Division is the product. And the reason I mentioned Donald Trump is because I think the president knows this, and the president is in the same business. I think the president is in the same industry as Candace Owens.
Yes, absolutely. He always was, and literally, it's what got him elected. Let me throw in a couple of names for you. Megyn Kelly. Now, she was somebody who's kind of been on a roller coaster, both within MAGA and professionally, and I think philosophically, right? She started out being the Fox reporter in the 2016 debates that Trump ridiculed when she was trying to stand up to him, show some backbone. It almost seems as if she took her beating, which was by a lot of accounts uncalled for on Trump's part during those debates. Um, she took her beating, came back, left Fox. Now she's grown wildly in popularity, but interestingly enough, not going against the guy who like tried to humiliate her on TV, but by supporting him in many ways. But in also in other ways, she seems to be somewhere between a Tucker and a Ben Shapiro. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I don't pay too much attention. I used to pay more attention to her show when she was on Fox News, and I remember her as being uh, hardworking, thorough, articulate, and in those days, really working hard at maintaining her credibility. You know, I, I don't know whether she was a good attorney or not, but she was good at being an attorney on TV,
Right.
and that made her show pretty successful. I know that she's gone in a couple of weird directions since then, but I think that that's just because she's learned how to play the commercial game, and it's not always about nothing but money. You know, there is ego here involved too. Some of these folks want lots of followers, not merely because they can monetize it, although I'm sure that may be most of the reason. But there are other reasons that include things that revolve around one's ego, whether that is just merely per se, the more people that listen to me, the more I feel better about myself, or the rest of my message is so important that it's worth saying, a few goofy things once in a while so that more people hear the really credible piece of my message. That is something that happens a lot. And I think that that is a part of what's going on with Candace. The other thing that is worth mentioning, maybe not twice, but I'll say it once, is that some of the things that Tucker says, that Megyn says, and the others, they probably do believe. There probably are plenty of situations where these folks are, uh, how do I say this without sounding like a complete idiot? Um, and yet give them the benefit of the doubt in certain circumstances, because there are plenty of different circumstances, right?
Right.
I really believe, having watched a couple of episodes of each of these people, you have to get the impression that in many cases they're trying to figure things out. It's just that they have a weird frame of reference. They have a hard time themselves ferreting out what the difference is between fact and fiction. So it's a lot easier for them to pursue something that, maybe they suspect isn't real. And then they pursue it. And then they find out boy, I'm really getting pretty far here, but it's working,
Mm. Mm.
right? In other words, what I'm trying to say is that there is a mix of naivete and just hubris and just commercialize commercialized disdain for the truth.
Yeah. I there is something to that. Um, but there's another one that's a separate subcategory of podcasters and influencers that I think were somewhat largely significant for the president's success in 2024. And that's the Joe Rogan. Now, Joe Rogan has his own sphere of influence, right? Like when it comes to, he's considered one of the OG podcasters.
Yep.
A couple of years ago, especially during the election time, his podcast was considered the number one podcast. We all heard about his.
I'm sure it still is.
It's one of the top ones. It's fallen a little bit, but Rogan also came with his own sphere of influence, and that's all those comedian podcasters: Theo Vaughn, Tim Dillon, um,
Yeah,
Tom
lots of
Segura's
guys.
podcast, all those guys, right? So what you had was people who wanted to curry favor. Andrew Schultz is another. People who wanted to curry favor with Rogan, by extension, had to curry favor with Trump, at least in their minds, right? So there
Yep.
was this, and again, give President Trump and his team credit. They tapped into that sort of like a driftless male, a white male in the U.S. They said, "What do they listen to?" Well, they listen to Rogan. They watch UFC. They watch
Yep.
MMA.
Yep.
You,
Yep.
you
Yep.
get Rogan on your side, you get Dana White on your side. Dana White gets the UFC on your side. Now all of a sudden you've got all these like
Yep.
hyper jacked up males. And they're on your side. They're promoting Trump after every fight. Very genius move on the part of the Trump team. But at the same time, Joe Rogan is now expressing um, remorse at being so openly supportive of Trump. Theo Vaughn has come out and said, "Don't even use my name," because they were using Theo Vaughn as part of those ICE sweeps, right? They
Yep.
were
That's right.
clips. He said, "Never use my name without my permission again." I do not agree with the
Yep.
policies of this government, right? And you
Yep.
see more and more of that. Do you think that that recruitment of that, let's call it the Rogan sphere into the MAGA sphere, and now that for the most part, say divide that from the UFC, we could talk about that separately. That's sort of like we're turning away from MAGA now because they're not America first. They seem to be Israel first. That
Because MAGA seems to be Israel first, you're saying.
MAGA, yeah,
Yep.
because Trump seems to be Israel first, right? And also, they're much more tied into the blue collar workers, which means they're much more tied into the everyday economy, which has
Yep.
also been going south for the president.
Yep.
So, just from that perspective, and again, we understand controversy creates cash, but from the perspective of support, it looks like, Mike, that the Rogan sphere is no longer aligned with the MAGA sphere.
Yes. This is a very important point. I agree with you. I would characterize the Rogan support, as you put it, the Rogan sphere support, as having always been contingent.
Mm.
I never got the impression that Joe Rogan jumped on as early as he might have, if this was just a commercial play, or as forcefully in the early days as he might have, if this was merely a commercial play and he thought that Trump was the thing to ride.
Oh,
I
sure. He was
always,
a Bernie bro. He said it out loud. He goes, I was a Bernie bro till he got stabbed in the back by Clinton. So,
yeah, yeah,
he was never a Trump guy. Yeah.
no, that's exactly right. Which is weird.
Mhm.
When Trump supporters and Bernie supporters overlap, and there's been a lot of that. A
Yes.
lot of the populist, anti-institutionalist,
Right.
anti-big corporations, right? No longer would you characterize that as overlapping with Trump very much. But in those days,
Yeah.
uh,
They were a block, the anti establishment block, no
the
doubt.
anti-establishment bloc, that's where Joe Rogan was, and a lot of his audience were there.
Alex
Yeah,
Jones. Yeah.
yeah, well, maybe not, the finest hour of that movement, but yeah,
Yeah.
good, interesting example.
Yeah.
And I think that this worked for Joe's format, right? We were making fun earlier that it's so long, but you can't. It would be impossible to accuse Joe Rogan of not being thoughtful, right?
Right. Right.
And you could call him a dingling if you want to. I don't. I think he's an average Joe. I think that's his shtick.
Right.
And I think he means well. I think he explores. Of course, he runs with certain topics because he thinks it'll sell. Of course, of course, of course. But that's part of being in the media. But his thoughtfulness always made the support for MAGA contingent, and so I'm not surprised that there's space between there now. And I also think it's one of the reasons why you don't hear quite as much about Joe Rogan in all of these podcast wars. It comes up, Joe's show comes up, but it's not as funny as Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens. They just are leaning into the fact that the if someone hates them, they get more views.
Yeah. Absolutely. I want to wrap this up a little bit now, and back to the original premise, which was it has nothing. These podcast wars, this internal conflict within the magosphere, really has nothing to do or little to do with policy, because there's been fault line issues. We've covered them: Iran, Gaza, Israel, the Epstein files, the economy, which is quickly plummeting in the U.S., the geopolitical movement of the BRICS countries, all that stuff. Those are all policy fault lines, and it's very hard to put rhyme or reason within the magosphere when it comes to the media personalities. But let's talk about actual things that are turning out. I actually have some data for you, Mike. I know you're a good Austrian economist. You love data points. Let me give some to you. The White House UFC spectacle, use that as a zeitgeist moment, which was to celebrate both President Trump's birthday and the 250th anniversary of the United States. It was attacked legally, right? Because of all the connections between government apportionments and how much the government had, the lack of transparency. Nobody knows how much the taxpayer footed the bill for the UFC to put on that show. The ratings.
That's in fair. I agree with you, by the way, and I agree with those who have concerns. In fairness, that's hard to figure out with programs that are completely on the up and up.
I,
So,
I agree, but it's just piling on, right? It's the
oh
lack of
yeah, 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 yeah.
uh, the ratings for that event, which is something when they work out in his favor, President Trump can't stop crowing about, right? I've gotten the best ratings of any president in history, right? Um, that came in as a 7% share on Paramount Plus, which was even below the Logan Paul event that he put on for the first time, which came in at 9.5%. So by UFC standards, this was a bust. Dana White said he's never doing it again. In terms of popularity, President Trump's overall approval, 36% as of mid June. Um, Trump approval among Republicans, specifically, 87%. Trump approval among self described MAGA Republicans, 98%. All right. Now, talk about some of these other people that I could find numbers for. Tucker Carlson, favorability among overall Republicans, 52%. Charlie Kirk, favorability among Republicans, 75%. That's what you were talking about.
Yeah.
Joe Rogan's favorability among Republicans, 62.5%. It's almost 63%. Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but when I look at these numbers and where I see things heading both politically, economically, geopolitically, it seems that we're moving away from the MAGA, hardcore MAGA, away from the super hardcore uh, principles that Trump came with, the draining the swamp, reject anything that's been there for more than 5 years. And if I look at the Rogan, Kirk approval, the Carlson approval to some extent, all being much higher than the president's, the 30 point, almost 30 point differential between traditional Republicans and MAGA Republicans specifically. What are we looking at, Mike? What's the trend we're looking here for the president and of MAGA when you look at these numbers as of June, as of like very recently?
The president has done a crappy job of managing his brand. That's what we're looking at, and that is notwithstanding everything he did that worked out so well for him on the way up. He's made some mistakes in terms of policy, and he's made some mistakes in terms of branding. And first of all, and that's a problem. But the other thing is that none of the rest of the people that you named who make their living by fighting each other, right? In other words, how do I say, if if you were mad at Candace, if you thought that Candace Owens was a dingling, as I do,
Right.
right? You wouldn't really argue that she's bad at her job. Her job is to say dingling things and get people to listen to her. She's actually quite good at her job. That's not President Trump's job. President Trump's job is to make sure that people make more money. Now, as a libertarian, I wouldn't characterize his job as such, but the people who are voting in your poll, right? They believe that that's his job.
Right.
His job is not to piss off Tucker Carlson or put his name on the wall of the Kennedy Center.
Right.
His job is to put more money in my pocket. I think that's how a lot of Americans think. And that's a lot closer to reality than Bridget McCrone has a penis.
Right.
Now, as libertarians, we might argue, well, his job is to create opportunity and get the government out of the way and, make nice with foreign governments, make sure we don't go to war and remove trade barriers. We would say all things like that. But for most Americans, I think that they would say something that's directionally similar to that, but more specific, which is his job is to make sure I have more money. That's a problem because that means that no matter how well you manage your brand, if I don't have more money, I'm not one of your supporters. And then the next layer up is if you're not even convincing me you care about that, now you've lost more supporters. So merely managing your brand in the same way that Tucker Carlson manages his, you're dealing with a relatively small proportion of the American electorate who cares.
I would argue, Mike, that your point is mechanically correct. But if I look at the numbers, let's say I'm still an analyst like I was before I retired. I'm saying that he's managing his brand great to his target audience. 98% of self-described MAGA Republicans love President Trump. 98%.
Well,
Where
that's
he
because MAGA is defined in their mind as pro-Trump.
well, that
I
and
don't think it can be anything but close to 100% because the moment that you say I'm not pro-Trump, when the phone rings and they say, "Are you MAGA?" they say no.
well, what's interesting about that is that I think, because I think that's partially true, but the other part of it is if you're really a MAGA Republican, you'll find ways to say this is going badly, but it's not President Trump's
That
fault,
may be. But to your
right?
point, I think that we need a longitudinal study. I
Wh-
think we need to ask the same 5,000 people
yes.
over and over again rather than because if you tell me 98% of MAGA is hanging out with Trump, I got to point out that MAGA is smaller than it used to be.
Well, that was going to be my next question, right? Because the numbers just don't add up, right? If the general population is, if 37%, 36% approve of President Trump's a job approval rating is
That
30.
means you have almost no Democrats, a whole lot of Republicans on one side.
The MAGA
You've,
Republicans on
you've
one side,
lost either you've lost every single independent,
which
and they
is
have lost most of them,
right,
but that means you've also lost some of the Republican Party. You can't get to 36
right.
unless
Well,
you've lost a lot of people.
right, and I think, look, when he first came around in 2014, I think when 2016 rather, I think what most people said is he's got the 1/3 that are MAGA folks. He's got them. He has to convince 50% of the remaining Republicans for him to win, right? I think
Yep.
that was the formula.
Yep.
And that's why his overall approval ratings were never all that high, right? They were always around that 50% in the
Yep.
general population.
Right.
And I
Right.
think now he may still have that same 30, 35% that were always MAGA, always Tea Party, always conspiratorial. I think he's just lost the traditional Republicans who were willing to hold their nose on Trump in order to retain power. I think he's lost that to a large
Yeah,
extent.
I agree with you, and I think there's a couple of different types in there. You mentioned Tea Party, you mentioned the traditionalists. You know, he might be hanging on to some of the neocons
Yeah,
from the previous generation.
ironically, by the way. Right.
Yes,
Yeah,
somewhat ironically. That's just a weird coalition,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
But, if you got Marco Rubio on your team, you might as well lean into that.
right.
If as long as you're bombing people, you might as well get some political bump from it from the
Right.
gray-haired crowd. Okay. The other thing is that the Tea Party morphed into a lot of, not all of them were popular, philosophical populists. A
The
lot of the
ones
Tea Party were uh
the ones that had any integrity were rooted out, right? So if you look at Justin Amash, if you look at Thomas
right, a lot of
Mason,
those people became libertarians, either members of the Republican Liberty Caucus,
right.
uh, but they're fiscally conservative. Definitionally fiscally conservative. That's what the Tea Party movement was all about.
It was more about money for them. It was more about the economy for the Tea Party
Absolutely.
and the ancillary stuff.
Yeah. You're
Right.
losing a lot of those people.
Yes. Yes,
That's my point.
but a lot of them stayed behind. I would say the blue collar faction of the Tea Party movement stayed with MAGA.
Yeah, some of them did.
Yeah.
And we just have a lot of folks who remember the Tea Party started with the reporter on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange.
Mm,
And a lot of that movement is extremely skeptical of the recent the administration's economic policies over the last year and a half.
right.
So you're losing a lot of those people.
Yeah. So, Mike, uh, as we look ahead to November, give me a very short summary. 6
Factionalism is good if you're in the media.
Okay, hold on. Let me just whip it around because I'll say this. Right after the election or right after President Trump took office, I think I said to you, let me take that. I mean, at the beginning of this year, let me correct that. I said to you, I don't think the Republicans are making it to the midterm elections.
Yeah,
I don't think, given the path they're on, they're going to suffer more than the historical losses.
yeah.
You kind of kept saying to me, I think they have time to turn it around if the president gets some better advice, et
Right,
cetera, et
right,
cetera.
right, right, right. I said they could pull it off if they do this, this, and this.
I'm
And they
assuming
didn't, they didn't, and they didn't.
there you go. I was going to say, do you still think given everything, including the political maneuvering, I'm saying take into account the gerrymandering, the Supreme Court decisions, all the weird like
Yep.
interim U.S. attorneys and all that. Do you still feel there's a chance to sort of stem the bloodletting in November?
Yeah, not much. There's not much chance. There's always hope. There's always chance. There's always opportunity. But there's nothing that you can see inside the Republican Party that would turn us around. I think that the Massey debacle was important.
Mm,
It demonstrated that the president still has a lot of political juice. Well, it demonstrated he has some,
mm,
but it also demonstrated that if you drop $15 million of pro-Israeli government money out of 20 something million dollars that was dropped into that district against Thomas Massey, right? The vast majority of it was angry with Massey over Middle East foreign policy.
sure.
Okay. That all succeeded in getting a nettlesome congressman out of the way.
Right.
Was it a smart move from the standpoint of holding your Republican coalition together? That's a very different question. And I
Yeah.
think that answer is probably no. I don't think you got a lot of people saying to themselves, now I want to support the president. I didn't before. But you do have quite a few people saying, I got a problem with that. I'm a Republican and I got a problem with Republican on Republican violence just because the guy who voted with you 90% of the time didn't vote 100% with you. That's a problem. I would say that that was a strategic error. There's a fundamental difference in how we should look at these polls for media versus for Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump has a fixed, finite pool of humans from which to draw.
Correct.
Right? And so when you do things to suck up to one group and you piss off the others, that's not getting you any juice. The Republicans' fight right now is to hold together the coalition and pick up a few independents. If you're a media podcaster, what you're trying to do is bring people in from the rest of the world, which is much bigger than you are, right? In Trump's case, he has to deal with a couple of 100 million voters. That's it. And he needs 100 million votes. He needs a huge proportion of the world that's out there. If you're a podcaster, you don't need a huge proportion of the world that's out there. You need a relatively small sliver of the world that's out there to be wildly successful.
Right.
Right? And so division is a viable strategy for a podcaster. One might argue that's the best strategy.
Right.
Right? You piss off some people and you win some people over and you divide and you conquer certain pieces. That's an excellent way to get yourself up to a million people. But Trump can't do that because a million people doesn't help him. Right? He needs 10 million. He needs 20 million. And for people like that, you need to hit issues like, do I have more money in my bank? How do I feel about the war in Gaza? Is it right that we send money to the government of Ukraine? These are pretty big fundamental issues.
Right.
And getting rid of Thomas Massey and putting your name on the Kennedy Center, it's not moving the needle.
You're right. And neither is the economy right now. But you know what's interesting, Mike? I heard that there's a book out there that kind of outlines this political divisiveness in our country and the effect.
A little bit. You're awfully kind to bring it up. There is a lot of overlap. The book that we did, called Broken, right? All about, look, the subtitle is obviously How American Politics is Driving Civil Unrest, Financial Collapse, and War.
Right.
The reason we say that is because we believe that we get bad policy by virtue of having bad politics. And I don't just mean merely politics is going too far to the left, too far to the right, and therefore we get policy that's too far to the left or too far to the... That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is our politics are broken.
Right.
So we lean into all this divisive bullshit that doesn't help us. And we fail to focus on what really matters, which is staying out of war,
Right.
resolving these conflicts, making sure we don't have meltdowns because of violating people's civil rights all over the United States. And the one that's on the railroad tracks coming at us already is making sure we don't spend so much money that the federal government can't make its interest payments the next few years. That's a real threat. And that threat means a collapse of the world economy. That's a problem. That matters. It's much larger than the issues, it's much larger than a UFC fighter screaming out that, Michelle Obama is a man.
Right.
Right? As stupid as that is, tee hee, giggle, giggle. It's not about whether he was right or wrong. We all know that he was wrong, but whether he says it or not, whether he, ends up civilly liable for libel or not, doesn't matter. If the government of the United States financially collapses and we're cast into a decades-long depression, It will be because our politicians behave the same way as podcasters. Podcasters can get away with it because I don't care.
Right.
When
Exactly.
politicians do it, they do it for the same reason, to make them commercially successful in terms of harvesting some votes and getting some money in. But it precludes us from addressing the issues in a fashion in which we need to, or else we're going to face existential threats to our federal government's ability to conduct business.
Well said, Mike. And everyone, go get your copy of Broken. Go to MikeTermott.com. The book is there. Go to Amazon.com if you prefer that. The book is there as well. Uh, Also, if you get the chance, hit that like button, smash the subscribe button, get notifications when the new episodes come out. We'd really appreciate it. It helps us out with the algorithm. Until next time, for Mike Termott and myself, Big John, peace, everyone.